Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kirsten Davis, and I am in Gulfport, Florida today to talk with you and our presenters about outcomes and assessment in legal communication. And here is a quick picture of me here in Gulfport today, and I'm your moderator for the day. Just for those of you who have never attended with us before, let me show you a little bit about what you're seeing on your screen. Here is the viewer window, and you can control the size of your viewer window down in this lower right-hand corner. Over here is your control panel, and by clicking this little button, you can open and close that control panel. Also, if you need to adjust your audio, this is the audio setup area. And most importantly, if you have questions for us as we move along, and I hope that you will, you can type your questions in this question box. And finally, if you do not want the little control panel to hide automatically, go to View on your control panel and uncheck the auto hide the control panel button, and this control panel will stay open the whole time. Otherwise, it will open and close by itself. So just to test our question and answer box, I thought I would ask all of you who are out there listening to maybe quickly answer a question for us. What kinds of outcomes and assessment projects are going on at your institution? And I'll give you a minute to type your answer in the Q&A box, and maybe we'll share those with our speakers. So anyone out there want to tell us the kinds of things that are going on? Anyone doing a curriculum review or working on outcomes? Here we go. Getting some answers now in from folks out there. Let's see. Kim says they're just starting to get informed about outcomes and assessment at their school. Linda says they're trying to do a program-wide assessment. Lisa says 5 learning outcomes and have been attempting how to assess those. Oh, good. Elena says as part of their program review process, they're completely reassessing their outcomes and assessments. And Judy says many proposals and a report written on outcome and assessments and approval pending. So lots of you are doing all sorts of things. Here Colleen says they're doing an overall curriculum review and working on objectives. Great. Okay. And Lee says they've developed outcomes and assessment for LW1 and 2. Boy, lots of things coming in. Well, thank you. So everyone today should be really motivated to learn more about outcomes and assessment. Great. Well, just a couple more things before we get to our speakers. The webinars are now available for replay. This one will be 2 in about a week. You can see on your screen how to access that information. Please feel free to share this with anyone in your school who might like to hear more. And all of our old webinars that we've done in the past, and we're now up to 8 of those, are stored in that Advocacy Resource Center. So we hope that you'll be able to access those there for replay. So just by way of a brief introduction, as most of you know, there has been a proposed change in the ABA accreditation standards, specifically in sections 302, 304, and 305. And the most recent proposal, which was in May, suggests that law schools should be required or could be required if the proposal passes, the change passes, to define learning outcomes, apply formative and summative assessment methods, and to institutionally measure success in learning outcomes. So moving in part from an inputs-based system to an outputs-based system. And what will that mean then for law schools? Well, today's panelists are going to talk about that issue. All three of them have a lot of experience with this. First, we'll be hearing from Susan Hanley Duncan, who is an associate professor of law at the University of Louisville. She's held a number of leadership positions in the field of legal writing, including as the All-Wed representative to the ABA Council for the section on legal education and admissions to the bar and the Standards Review Committee. Most recently, Susan has published an article on outcomes and assessment entitled "The New Accreditation Standards Are Coming to a Law School Near You, What You Need to Know About Outcomes and Assessment." And that article appears in the Journal of the Legal Writing Institute. And Susan will actually be speaking to us last in the list today. Vicki Van Zandt will be talking to us today, and she is an associate professor of lawyering skills at the University of Dayton. Recently, she presented in a breakout session at the Legal Writing Institute Biennial Conference entitled Assessment Planning in Legal Research and Writing Courses, and she is writing in the area as well. Her most recent article appears in the Legal Writing Institute Journal, and it's called "Creating Assessment Plans for Introductory Legal Research and Writing Courses." There we go. We lost my PowerPoints for a minute, and now we're back. And finally, Mel Warish, who is a professor of law and director of legal writing at Drake Law School, will be speaking to us on developing course-level outcomes. She has written on a number of topics, including including legal writing pedagogy and ethics issues. And most recently, she's been working on a project for which she received an All-Wed teaching grant to develop course-level outcomes for a research and writing course with special emphasis on ethics and professionalism. So the order of our presenters today will be Professor Van Zandt presenting on outcomes and assessment generally, Professor Warish talking about developing course-level outcomes, and Professor Duncan talking about aligning outcomes across the curriculum. And so now we will turn to our speakers, and we'll be starting with Professor Van Zandt. And I'm going to turn the screen over to Professor Van Zandt now. Vicki?
I'm here.
Okay, great. And
can everyone see my screen?
We can see your screen.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, Kirsten, for that introduction. I'm Vicki Van Zandt at University of Dayton, and very excited to be talking with you about assessment today. As Kirsten pointed out, probably the main reason we're talking about assessment right now is because of the ABA and its accreditation standards. As she said, they are looking at changing the accreditation standards through Chapter 3, which is the Program of Legal Education. And as she pointed out, probably the biggest change is that it is going to require some type of assessment planning at law schools, which basically means that law schools are now going to have to provide evidence of student learning throughout the curriculum. But it's nothing new that the ABA is doing. Actually, regional accrediting bodies for higher education have been doing this for many years. And specifically, I started talking about assessment, or with my institution, about 3 years ago when the university that we're affiliated with, which is University of Dayton, when they were required through their regional accrediting body to have each one of their departments create an assessment plan. The law school was seen as a department, so 3 years ago we were asked to create an assessment plan, and we didn't know exactly what we were doing. So it got us talking about it about 3 years ago. But regardless of the reason that we're talking about it, I really think that we should be talking about it. It is the future of legal education. On Friday, I think many of you probably saw an email come across the listserv from Ken Chestik on behalf of the Legal Writing Institute, and he was sending the letter to the ABA in support of the proposed standards. And in there, he touted the expertise of legal research and writing faculty, and I absolutely echo his sentiments. I think we are the experts in assessment. Even though we may not know it at this point, I think what I'd like to do is just show you that you are experts, give you the terminology, and show you how to take what you already do in your classes and put them into a formalized assessment plan. So one thing I want to get to at this point before I go any further is I'm going to be talking about course-level assessment planning. However, assessment planning does occur on different levels within a law school. It occurs on the institutional level where the whole law school has its own assessment plan, can be winnowed down to the program level, for example, a legal research and writing program assessment plan, and then on your individual courses. And Susan will talk a little bit later about how each one of those should be aligned so that you are looking at the same type of student learning outcomes. And it's extremely important. So, for example, if the institutional plan has an outcome that says, we will graduate students who are competent in legal research, yet legal research is not taught anywhere throughout the curriculum. Obviously, there's a breakdown in the curriculum and the assessment planning levels. So, what is assessment? Here is a basic definition that you see about assessment, and this is for course level assessment. It is a set of practices by which an educator identifies student learning outcomes and measures her effectiveness in attaining these outcomes. There's a lot of jargon within assessment, and that's what I hope to demystify or clear up a little bit. First, what does it mean? What do student learning outcomes mean? How does one measure her effectiveness in obtaining those outcomes? And what does it actually mean to attain those outcomes? It's probably easier defined by looking at assessment in a cycle, and that's typically what you see as assessment is represented in a cyclical form. The first thing is the creation of learning outcomes. That's where you ask questions about student learning and development. What do I want my students to be able to know, do, or value when they leave my course? The second step is gathering evidence using assessment tools. You're gathering evidence to see whether those outcomes are actually being met. The third step is to analyze the assessment data. You need to interpret the evidence to see what can be discovered about students' strengths and weaknesses. And then 4 is actually using those discoveries to change the learning environment so that student performance will be improved. And that's what's called closing the loop of assessment. So going to the first step, creating learning outcomes. Learning outcomes are very simply defined as the knowledge-based skills, values, which the educator desires students to exhibit on completion of the course. It typically answers these 3 questions. What does the graduate of the course know? What is the graduate of the course able to do? And what does the graduate of the course value? As you can see, those are the 3 apprenticeships from the Carnegie Foundation: knowledge, skills, and value. However, learning outcomes are typically more broad. So to give them more definition and meaning, I suggest using what are called performance criteria. Performance criteria are measurable, and they indicate the specific characteristics students should exhibit in order to demonstrate the desired achievement of the learning outcomes. So, for example, it's easier to put this in a plan so you can see what I'm talking about. The first column here is your learning outcome. Now, you're going to have multiple learning outcomes in any course. So here, I think we could all agree that in a basic legal research and writing course, we would say that a graduate can perform effective and efficient legal and non-legal research. However, how do we show that a graduate's able to do that? And somehow, I apologize for that. My PowerPoint was going on by itself. Somehow, we need to be able to show that the student's able to research. So that's why we have these performance criteria. Here is something that the student, this is a specific characteristic that the student can exhibit to show that they're meeting the learning outcome. So here you can see that they have to be able to use the fundamental tools of legal and non-legal research, both print and electronic sources. So they have to be able to use print and electronic sources with competency, and being able to do that shows that they can meet the learning outcome. Okay? First thing that you see is with competency, and there's a lot of discussion and debate about this. What are the competency levels? I've went ahead and put competency in my plan right there, but these are the 5 levels that I use: novice, advanced beginner, competent, proficient, and expert. And these are the levels of professional expertise. You can use whatever levels you want. I think what I'm trying to stress here is the importance of putting some type of level in. And this goes to the alignment that Susan will talk about later. So in an introductory course, it shouldn't be the highest level, because we are assuming that somewhere else in the curriculum, these skills are going to be reinforced. So in a lower level course, in an introductory course, it would be a lower level, and then each time the student takes a course where that learning outcome is assessed, it should get higher and higher. Now, in the proposed ABA standards, when they were first sent out, there was a mixture of levels in it. They talked about competent, they talked about proficient. Now that they've been revised, it's competent throughout the proposed standards. So that's where they say our students should come in when they're graduating law school. At this point, though, the term competency is not defined in the standards, so there's still some fleshing out of that to do. And Mel's going to talk more about the creation of learning outcomes here in a moment. I'm going to keep going through. The next step is the gathering of data using assessment tools. This is where our expertise comes in. And I'm just going to swing through a couple terms here. Embedded assessment basically refers to classroom exercises that you use to assess students' meeting of the learning outcomes. So really, it's you looking at your syllabus and seeing, what do I do in my class? And how am I assessing certain skills? We use multiple assessment methods in any of our classes. So they're already embedded, and they're embedded because we use them for a grade. Now you can get double duty out of those and set aside a set number of samples to look at for assessment purposes. You'll also hear about direct versus indirect assessment methods. Direct just means that the student is actually performing. Indirect is the student's opinion or another person's opinion of their performance. We use a lot of direct assessment methods in our courses. Indirect, possibly not as much. Examples of indirect methods might be surveys or reflective essays. Then the terms also formative assessment versus summative assessment. We do a lot, and as Ken Chestic pointed out in his letter, we do a lot of formative assessment. Formative assessment basically means that we provide feedback throughout the course for the student to be able to improve his or her performance. Summative is the typical doctrinal final exam. It is assessment after the fact. The student has no ability to basically improve their performance. They're not getting feedback. It's a high-stakes end of the semester exam. After you've used assessment tools to determine the extent which the learning outcomes are achieved, you then have to analyze that data. Before we get to that, I'm sorry, let me go back and look at my chart. You have the learning outcome, the same one about research, the performance criteria. Then I've added a column where I look at the assessment tools. These are all things that I actually have in my syllabi already that I use for grading purposes. They can also be used for the double duty of assessment. As you will see, the first four actually are direct formative exercises. The last one, the reflective essay, would be a type of indirect assessment where I could ask students, what do you feel are your strengths about research? What do you feel are your weaknesses? How do you think you could improve? Now, going on to the third step is to analyze the assessment data. I always say at the beginning of the year, pick out one learning outcome that you want to focus on. What have you felt in the past that your students may be weak at? So, for example, I may feel that it may be research. So I pick that one learning outcome. Now here, we're already very fortunate because we already have our assessment techniques in place. We already have, as I showed you in the former example, we already have all of those assessment tools already embedded in our course. So throughout the semester, I don't need to do anything. I've already determined that at the end of the semester, I'm going to look at those assessment results. So I've picked a learning outcome. At the end of the semester, I'm going to review a set of examples of those assessment tools. So I've already graded all of those things that were in that third column. Now I'm going to take a set number of samples and look at them for assessment purposes. The number of samples, there's really no exact number. I've seen anywhere from 10% to 25%. So let's say in a class of 40, I could possibly look at between 5 and 10 samples of each one of those exercises. And when I look at them, I'm going to be looking at them myself. And there's a big debate as to whether the evaluator, the one who's looking at the assessment data, should be the professor herself or if they should use an outside assessor. I believe for course level assessment, it's just as easy for the professor to do it herself. On an institutional level, there's probably more debate about it being an outside assessor. And then lastly, when you're looking at the samples, you use rubrics. Again, that's nothing new for all of us. We use rubrics all the time, but for others in academia, the idea of using rubrics to assess something is a little bit more difficult. So I've looked at my samples. I've focused specifically on my students' research skills. I've looked at them anonymously to try to get an overall view of the students' strengths and weaknesses. And then going to step 4, I need to close the loop. I need to use that data to improve student learning. So I can revise my syllabi. I may alter emphasis on research. I may modify my teaching strategies. I may retool assignments, add more assignments, add shorter, quick turnaround research assignments, whatever I need to do based upon the data that I receive throughout the year. So what does it mean to you as an LRW faculty? And I like to think of the three-legged stool of an academic. It absolutely improves your teaching because while you are receiving feedback about student learning, you're also receiving feedback about your teaching. So it will improve your teaching the more assessment that you do within your course. I also think there's a huge area of open scholarship here. With the ABA coming on board with assessment techniques, I think there's going to be a big call for how do we do it? What is it? What are formative assessment techniques? How does one use rubrics? So I think a lot of what has seen as being non-traditional legal scholarship will now come to the forefront, where not only we will be reading each other's work, but it may be more read by other academics, legal academics. And then service requirements. Especially at your own institution, I know I was called upon to be on my assessment committee, and I had no background, but it was because I was an LRW faculty member. I think a lot of us will be called on to help our other faculty members understand the basics of assessment and good formative feedback, use of rubrics, and stuff like that. So I think assessment's very important. I think it's very exciting that we're all talking about it, and I'm going to pass it off at this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicki. And I am going to turn it over now to Professor Warish, who's going to be talking about developing course-level outcomes. So, Mel? Hang on just a second and let me set you up with your audio. Just 1 second.
Okay.
Mel, there we go. Great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was a very helpful overview of the assessment process from Vicki. My piece of the puzzle is writing student learning outcomes for a legal research and writing course, and as Kirsten mentioned, and I would like to publicly acknowledge the Association of Legal Writing Directors who supported my research in this area. So let's start with a little bit of context. As Vicki noted, the assessment terminology can be somewhat inconsistent, particularly with regard to terms such as mission, goals, objectives, outcomes. I think that part of the difficulty stems from the various developments over the years in approaches to education. We've seen shifts from objective-based educational models to ones that are competency-based and currently to an outcomes-based model. The image you're viewing, the outcomes pyramid, I think provides a useful representation of the sort of hierarchical relationships amongst several different kinds of goals, objectives, and outcomes that appear in the assessment literature. As Vicki noted, in assessment planning, the institution will likely have a broadly stated mission. Programs within the institution may similarly have broad missions that are articulated more specifically in terms of goals and, as reflected on the image, increasingly specific with regard to outcomes at the course level. To my mind, we do need to have a consistent understanding of the terms because this helps us make reasoned choices when we draft course-level student learning outcomes. Goals and objectives tend to be more aspirational. They're intended results or consequences of instruction, whereas outcomes are achieved results or consequences of instruction. Outcomes are evidence that learning did take place. And I think this distinction is important in terms of how we write outcomes that are meaningful to both the professor and the student and that are measurable. So what's a student learning outcome? Here's another definition. It's a specifiable activity, product, behavior, knowledge, skill, ability, or attitude that we want students to manifest in measurable or observable ways, indicating whether desired learning has occurred and to what degree it has occurred. Student learning outcomes are often defined as statements that specify what students know, value, or are able to demonstrate when they've completed or participated in a program, activity, course, or project. Just by way of a little bit more background, assessment in education has its roots in primary and secondary education, but as Vicki noted, it's now a reality of accreditation at the higher education level, and in all likelihood will be coming to law schools as a result of developments in the ABA accreditation standards. Therefore, we're all going to begin developing course-level student learning outcomes. The image you see reflects the relationship between student learning outcomes and the institutional mission. The goal in developing student learning outcomes is to design them backward with a foundation in the institutional mission and then deliver them forward to students. I think this image also provides a helpful visual representation of the benefits specifically of developing course-level student learning outcomes. Student learning outcome development is both deliberate and recursive in nature. So if we consistently focus on the outcome of student learning, it should help us select content for our courses. It will also inform the instructional strategy and the materials we provide. And because the development of student learning outcomes requires us to focus on assessment of particular behavioral objectives, it's going to inform our development of assessment tools, both formative and summative, which should improve the feedback that we give students. And because the assessment process is cyclical, it provides consistent opportunity for improvement, both with regard to the delivery of information and the assessment of student learning, and with regard to how we frame or reframe our student learning outcomes or behavioral objectives. So let's turn our attention to how we will frame those. I think these questions provide a useful starting point for framing the outcomes themselves. First, you want to ask, what do you want from the student? Is it some form of knowledge, or do you want a student to be able to do or to demonstrate something? That's the behavioral objective or the outcome. In terms of developing a written outcome statement, you also want to ask what the student will need to know in order to achieve the outcome and what kind of activity is going to facilitate the learning. As you begin to write the student learning outcomes, you also want to think about how students are going to perform, how are they going to demonstrate the outcome. This involves your assessment tool and your performance criteria. And finally, how will you know the student has performed well? So let's start with behavioral objectives or outcomes associated with legal research and writing. What types of things do we want students to know or to be able to do when they've completed the course? I thought this would be relatively easy. I've taught this course for a number of years, but this actually took a lot more time and reflection and research than I anticipated. The core outcomes you see reflected here come in large part from the source book on legal writing programs and the types of things that experts have agreed likely occur in a legal research and writing course. I teach my course with a special emphasis on the types of ethical rules that impact written and oral communication, so I knew that was going to be a core outcome of my course as well. These are essentially the things I want my students to know or to be able to do when they've completed my course. So if these are sort of the categories of core outcomes, how can I express them in a manner that's consistent with that of the assessment literature? Well, I learned that no significant discussion of outcomes or assessment would be complete without some discussion of Bloom's taxonomy. Who is this guy and why is his material relevant to legal education? Benjamin Bloom was an educational psychologist who identified 3 categories or domains of learning. These included the cognitive domain or knowledge, the affective domain or attitude, and the psychomotor domain or skills. I found those categories to really be helpful in terms of thinking about the goals of legal education because they do resonate with the 3 apprenticeships of knowledge, skills, and values you see reflected in the Carnegie Report. But moreover, Bloom identified the hierarchy you see depicted here on the screen. Bloom's theory was that educational objectives could be organized into a hierarchy based on their cognitive complexity. In framing the hierarchy, Bloom believed that educators might have a more reliable procedure for assessing students and the outcomes of educational practice. But in fact, his contribution went much further because the hierarchy also provides a framework in which to actually draft outcomes themselves with the use of guided action verbs to more clearly correlate with the learning objectives at each end of the spectrum. So let's turn our attention to a formula for constructing the outcomes. There's a tremendous amount of material available on writing outcomes, and there's a lot of recommendations about essential and supplemental content. To my mind, these are the basic ingredients of a student learning outcome. You obviously clearly want to identify your target group, who's going to perform. We're going to frame a particular behavioral objective, which may be further illustrated by performance criteria. As we frame the student learning outcome, we want to be thinking about the assessment tools we're going to use, as this may help us to craft the language of the outcome itself. Finally, we want to be thinking about the performance level we expect of students at the completion of the course or the task or the project. And this is actually where the work of Bloom is most helpful. When we articulate a behavioral objective, we want to use concrete, specific active verbs so that there's no question for the professor or the student what the outcome is. I actually found this to be a relatively challenging aspect of the task. What you see here is Bloom's taxonomy wheel. In order to be effective, student learning outcomes must be clear to the learner and must be measurable and observable. So educators have relied heavily on this taxonomy wheel to identify active verbs to use in constructing outcomes. The wheel is tied to the learning hierarchy we saw earlier. So in purple, you see the domain or the category of learning. Remember that knowledge is a lower order domain, more easily assessed and measured, whereas evaluation is a higher order and arguably more difficult to measure. In yellow, you see the types of active verbs to use to construct a student learning outcome for a particular domain, and in green, you see assessment tools to measure the outcome. So let's put the wheel into practice. Recall that one core outcome of a legal research and writing course was citation. How might we frame that as a student learning outcome? This is a broad student learning outcome for citation, a core competency of the course. You see the target group reflected, which is the student. The behavioral objective of being able to cite is framed with an active verb. We want students to recognize and identify the purpose of citation, and we want them to perform by actually citing in accordance with one authoritative source. I've shared these outcomes with several people and gotten some interesting feedback, and one bit of information I got was a question about why I framed this to be citing in accordance with at least one authoritative source, and I did make that deliberate choice. I teach the Allwood Citation Manual, and my expectation is that my students will know how to cite in accordance with that reference tool. I included at least one because I also give instruction on the Blue Book, and because I think both the Blue Book and the Allwood Manual are reference tools, my position is that they should be able to use both. But I don't assess performance with respect to the Blue Book, so I didn't specifically include it. I may modify that. This is the first year I've used this particular student learning outcome, and I made that deliberate choice. In identifying my student learning outcome, I also want to communicate to students how they're going to perform the outcome, what performance criteria will demonstrate the outcome. So what you see here are the measurable, observable performance criteria associated with the citation outcome. Performance criteria are created by tying the course learning outcomes to specific active performance. So to measure that core outcome of citation, I would expect students to be able to cite to every legal proposition and employ accurate citation format. Another ingredient that we saw for writing student learning outcomes were the assessment tools. So further building on the outcome, I identify for students the tools I will be using to assess that outcome of citation. In my course, citation is assessed in the context of writing exercises as well as dedicated citation and attribution exercises. So students now have a clear understanding of the context in which the learning outcome will be measured. As Vicki noted, performance levels are often communicated directly to students. At what level do I expect you to perform the various outcomes and performance criteria? And there are a variety of ways to express performance levels, and you see two reflected here. Recognize that in the ABA's contemplated model of outcomes assessment, the highest level of performance expected at graduation will be that of competency. The idea is that proficiency and expert levels are achieved after years of practice. I recognize that I teach an introductory level course, the skills and knowledge of which will be reinforced across the curriculum. So I wasn't exactly sure on where I wanted students to end up for any of the performance criteria or outcomes. I had a sense that they should be near a level of advanced beginner for many, if not all, of the learning outcomes, but I chose not to identify the performance levels in this year, but to map the performance criteria across the curriculum to try to identify the varying level of competence that I would expect for certain outcomes. As a final matter, I just thought I'd show you a couple of different presentation formats you can employ to communicate the outcomes to students. What you see here is the course level student learning outcome associated with that core knowledge outcome of a basic understanding of the legal system of the United States. This is a foundational knowledge-based outcome for the course. Note the use of active verbs, identify, recognize, apply. What you see here is the student learning outcome, performance criteria, and assessment tools presented in sort of a outline framework. An alternative presentation framework that you saw on Vicki's slides and here is a chart. This is the manner in which I provided the outcomes to my students this year, and I just thought I'd recognize because I thought it was interesting. I had a couple of non-traditional students, one who had children in the primary education level and one who came from teaching in the primary education level. And when I provided this chart, they each indicated that it looked eerily familiar with the materials they had either received or provided at parent-teacher conferences. For whatever reason, this particular presentation style resonated with me, and that's how I chose to communicate them to students. And finally, we come full circle. This is simply a presentation of the core outcomes of legal research and writing that we had categorically stated earlier, and now they're stated in terms of outcome language with active verbs. I have the full complement of performance criteria and assessment tools for each of the 8 core outcomes of legal research and writing in both formats, both the outline model and the chart model, and I'm more than happy to share that with anyone and really eager to receive any feedback that you have. But for now, I will turn the screen over to Susan, who can talk about aligning the outcomes across the curriculum.
Thank you so much, Mel, for that. That was really great. And Susan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Susan is now going to talk about aligning outcomes across the curriculum, and I'm going to go ahead and give you the screen, Susan.
Okay, great. I'm so glad to be with you all today. It's a real honor to get to talk to with these other women, and I'm sure a lot of you know more about this than some of us do. The thing about curriculum mapping is there are entire books written on this, so this can only be just a brief introduction to the concept. Curriculum mapping is really a deliberate kind of process to design curricula that actually identifies and supports student achievement of learning outcomes that you've been hearing about. And when I first heard the term, I really had no idea what it was at all when I first started going to the ABA meetings and getting more into assessment literature. But for today's discussion, I thought we could use this as a definition, a process by which all teachers document their own curriculum, then share and examine each other's curriculums for gaps, overlaps, redundancies, and new learning, creating a coherent, consistent curriculum within and across schools that is ultimately aligned to standards and responsive to student data and other school initiatives. So we'll talk about this more as we get into the presentation, but a key component of it is that we actually share and examine each other's curriculums, which will be interesting, I think, in a law faculty when we're not usually doing that with each other. So where did this idea of curriculum mapping come from? I think the term was originated in 1980s, or at least first became popular in the 1980s, by a man named Fenwick W. English. And he actually used the term to describe the taught curriculum as compared to the written curriculum. And the idea was he wanted to find some kind of conceptual way to indicate that the actual curriculum taught in the classroom may be very different than the one put to paper by the curriculum developers. In the 1990s, Heidi Hayes Jacobs really broadened his term curriculum mapping to the definition that I used above, which includes this multi-phase process. And when I was preparing for this speech, I had gotten a book written by English, and I think he's a little bit disturbed that this has happened, that this is now a broader process than what he originally had meant by the term curriculum mapping. K through 12 educators, like Mel said, have engaged not only in writing outcomes, but in this process of curriculum mapping for years. And law schools are really relatively new to this process, I believe, even though I do know that some schools around the country are already doing this. For example, Nova Southeastern has done this, and Deborah Curtis has written a great article about it posted on SSRN. Charlotte Law School's done it, and I believe Denver and Dayton also have done this. So I hope maybe some of you who are out there will send in some comments about their experiences doing curriculum mapping later in the webinar. But for those of us that have not done this, I think we may soon have to do it with the changes in these new ABA rules. The proposed standard for 303 states that a law school shall offer a curriculum that is designed to produce graduates who have attained competency in the learning outcomes identified in Standard 302. So probably the best way for us to know if we're offering such a curriculum is by asking professors to document the content and the skills they're teaching, and then to provide opportunities for them to talk to one another about their real classroom teaching and how those practices are affecting their students. Before outlining the curriculum mapping process, I wanted to talk briefly about the benefits of the process, whether or not they're ever required by the ABA. First, curriculum mapping really empowers professors, and I hope that's been the experience for the people that have done it. One study of curriculum mapping in higher ed found that it empowers professors by helping them to grow as a collaborative community, to connect with each other and decrease isolation, and it helps to promote and support that collaborative culture. I think that's one of the complaints with younger professors in the academy is they do feel so isolated. So this is an excellent way to try to work on getting a culture that makes them feel included. One of the articles I looked at started with a great African proverb, and it said, "To go fast, go alone. To go farther, go together." So I thought we should keep that in mind as we talk about curriculum mapping. We also, I think, can all agree that curriculum mapping should be based on the best interest and needs of the students. So engaging in a curriculum mapping process helps us to make sure that we really are thinking about what the students are learning and not just what we're teaching individually. And sharing the maps once they're completed helps the students understand just how the courses fit together and how they help meet the learning objectives that they've been told they will receive. And finally, I think if we don't do curriculum mapping, law schools really run the risk of delivering an uncoordinated course of study that might not support our students to demonstrate and achieve those desired results we want. So stepping back and having time to reflect will help the faculty create and revise the curriculum, which ultimately will benefit the students. And I know just at our school, many times I've been in a faculty meeting and we've approved a new course, and we really, at least I haven't thought about, well, how does this fit in with the overall curriculum and how does it fit in with our objectives? So I think engaging in this process will help us make sure that whatever our legal education program is, it's consistent and it's coherent. So how does it work? This next slide shows the process of curriculum mapping. So you'll see that stage one, you develop or create individual maps. And it's at this stage that you will really need to decide if you want to engage in backwards mapping or forwards mapping. So forward mapping would require teachers to record their planned content and skills and assessment for the entire school year. This might be rather difficult if you don't keep good lesson plans from your previous year. So to try to imagine, what am I going to teach, what kind of skills, and how will I assess that for the whole year? Although it takes longer, some teachers might rather do backwards mapping, which asks the teachers to document the content, skills, and assessment at the end of the month and do that throughout the year and then put it together. The next two stages are about reviewing the maps. And so you review the maps horizontally, so you see how all the property courses line up or how all the legal writing courses line up. And then you review the maps vertically to see how all the different years and how the different courses build on each other. In a great book called Keys to Curriculum Mapping, the author suggests that as you're reviewing these, you really need to look at about 6 main things. First, you're reviewing the maps to see, is there a clear connection between the content, the skills, and the assessment? Do you see that they all relate to each other? Secondly, you're looking to see if these courses have clear and concise skills. So as Mel mentioned, are the skills listed as action verbs? Then, as Victoria talked to you all about, you're looking at a variety of assessments. Is there a balance of assessments, and is there required documentation of observation type assessments? So again, looking at the assessments for each individual course, then all the same courses, and then throughout the curriculum, how do you do the assessments? Then you look in stage 4, you're looking at the possible gaps. Is there content that you say you're going to teach or skills you say you're going to teach these graduates, but you can't find it in any class when you look at all the maps? Or do you see that there's a lot of meaningless redundancies? Do you see that there are topics that are being taught at multiple times during the law school education and they're just redundant? And then I think both prior speakers before me did a really good job of emphasizing that these skills need to be reinforced. So you're looking, when you look at the maps, for repetitions in the content and the skills, and whether or not that curriculum reflects a repetition that build or spiral, so you get to the higher levels of competency as you go up the stages of your law school career. Then finally, those later stages of the process include developing an action plan, so figuring out the timetables, who's responsible to address the specific issues that are identified as you reviewed the maps. So the faculty should be asking these 3 critical questions during that 6-part process. 1, who's doing what? So who is teaching what? Secondly, how does it align with the learning outcomes identified by the law school? So make sure that what we're teaching actually does align up to what we've said we want our students to learn. And then the most important one, are we doing this efficiently and effectively? And the only way we'll know is by looking at this in a whole instead of just individually. So how do you get your faculty to do this? This is where I really love some input from people out in the audience, because the ones who've done it can probably give us real specific ideas. From what I've looked at it in the literature, it said a lot of times you could use existing meetings so they're not annoyed by going to different meetings, but then offers professional development activities which help educate the faculty about how to do this, and that it's in their best interest to do it and won't just be another thing to take up their time. I think we also need to do a good job of disseminating handouts and articles, and I know the Legal Writing Institute has just formed a new committee about the ABA standards, and that's what we plan to do with our committee, is to actually put on our website lots of helpful resources that you can share with your faculty so you can be the leader in either how to draft learning outcomes or how to do curriculum mapping. And then finally, I know a lot of K through 12 organizations use curriculum mapping software, so some law schools might be exploring whether or not there's some technology that could help them in this process. I have to switch PowerPoints just for a minute here because I want to show you a slide that I saw when I was down at Charlotte's assessment conference last May. And they gave me permission, Cynthia Adcock gave me permission to share this with you all, and I think it does a great job of kind of showing the process with a real law school. You can see that up at the top, they identified their mission and pillars. So they wanted to, this is what drives their curriculum. They wanted their students to be practice ready. They wanted the curriculum to be student-centered and serve the underserved. And they identified 10 outcomes for all their graduates. So intellectual and analytical reasoning, problem solving, written and oral communication, information and communication technology, negotiation, practice management, professional relations, professional ethics, leadership and social responsibility, and self-reflection and lifelong learning. So they identified these outcomes, and then I think it might have been Victoria said to give them a little bit more substance, how would they know if they were meeting these outcomes? They looked at performance standards, and they broke those performance standards into 5 main areas: substantive knowledge, professional values, relational skills, cognitive skills, and communication skills. And when we were down in Charlotte, they said that the next step for them would be to actually map out the curriculum and try to figure out where is each of these components either introduced, because remember we want to reinforce it, so where is it introduced, how is it practiced, and how is it assessed, and then where could we be teaching the components. So they were going to go through the little chart to the right, each of their classes, and look to try to align their outcomes and performance standards with their actual coursework. So this was a really nice slide, and I thank them again for letting me show it to you. Finally, just in summary, I wanted to leave you with some helpful resources. This is the book I was talking about earlier, The Keys to Curriculum Mapping. It's written for K through 12, but I think a lot of it is very applicable to law schools too, so I found it very helpful. And then a few other articles that I think are very helpful. And finally, this website has a great glossary and some FAQs, so as you're starting to maybe talk to your faculty about engaging in the curriculum mapping process, that website might be a great place to refer people to just for an introduction. So I'm going to give it back to Professor Davis.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Hang on a minute and I'll take the screen back, hopefully. And like everyone else, I've managed to lose my PowerPoint. So we have a few questions for you. Unfortunately, interestingly enough, a fire alarm went off in Vicki's building, and she had to leave. They made her go, and she's to come back if she can, but I don't know if we expect her back. So Mel and Susan are still on the line, and we've gotten some questions from our from our listeners, and so I'll ask the two of you the one that I had saved for Vicki. This is a question from, I believe it's Kirsten out there. Much of what I am hearing is an assessment upon the conclusion of the first year. Is it preferable to assess student learning outcomes at the end of the first year rather than at the end of both the first and second semester? And if so, why?
This is Mel. I think that's a great question, and I'm not sure there's a, I guess I'll take it from the development of the student learning outcomes perspective, because I struggled with whether I wanted to draft the student learning outcomes for my course, and like many of you, I do objective predictive writing in the fall and appellate advocacy in the spring. You know, I think you're supposed to be assessing throughout. The question may be, do you write the outcomes, you know, for a semester or for the entire course? And I think that's up to you. I did it for the entire year, and the more I reflect on that, the more I think I actually think I want to begin to develop the outcomes and the assessment tools more specifically, almost by project. So that would be my feedback. Susan, do you?
Yeah, I would think it might be good to do by semester, because then you can actually use the data to improve the teaching for the next semester. So you
Yeah.
wouldn't have to wait a whole year. I mean, those students that you have for the whole year would get the benefit if you were doing it semester. A lot of it's probably just time, if you have the time to do that.
Right, right.
Okay, and Mel, a question came out specifically for you about how you share the performance criteria that you articulate with your students. Are those disclosed in an assignment, in the syllabus? How do you do that?
Yeah, that's another question and kind of relates, I guess, to my response to the first question. I did provide them with the sort of minimum competencies, the core outcomes, and the performance criteria for the 2-semester course at the beginning of this semester. It was as part of their syllabus. As I was drafting these, I actually ended up drafting a project-based set of performance criteria under the writing learning outcome that goes specifically to a predictive memo. And I was somewhat reluctant to do that because one of the things I think that took me so long in this project is that I wanted what I was doing to be consistent with the literature that I was reading, and I wasn't sure that I wasn't seeing a lot of project-based performance criteria. But that worked really well for me, and it occurred to me that whatever works well in terms of communicating what your desired outcomes are for students is probably a good idea. So for their final memo, I intend to provide them with a performance criteria for that project, but I did provide them with the 8 student learning outcomes and all of their corresponding performance criteria and the assessment tools at the beginning of the year.
Susan, do you share outcomes with your students?
I did for the first time this year. I put those in my syllabus also. But I have not done it her assignment, so that would be a good idea, I think.
I was just going to say focusing in on the assignment, I think was useful for me to try to identify those objectives and outcomes that will be reflected in the particular assignment.
Ellen is asking this question for either of you, Susan or Mel. Do you align the performance outcomes like novice, advanced, beginner with particular grades? And how do you mesh together sort of grading on a curve and giving these competency indicators?
Susan, do you want to?
I do not do that with the grades. I mean, I think that assessment is different than the actual grading and what the grade is. It's a different purpose behind it. I wish we had Victoria back here because I think that was one of the points she made.
Yeah, I agree with what you said though, Susan. I don't think that I see those as sort of distinct, and we might, if we say everybody's competent, we might have students who are performing at even higher levels at the end of the first year, and those will be the students who are also getting rewarded with good grades. The targeted performance level is something that's different from the grades that we assign to individual students for their performance. So I don't do that either, but of course, as I noted, I decided not to communicate the performance level this year until I had a better understanding of what I wanted to see and felt more confident about. I think they can be different. I think the performance levels can be different for the different performance criteria.
Susan, when you were talking about the notion of a learning spiral, Tim out there listening, and I thought of this as well, this notion of recursive versus redundant versus reinforcing versus repetitive, and you were talking about mapping to assure that you don't have unnecessary redundancies. How do you go about determining that when you're looking at mapping across your curriculum?
Well, I think you'd have to do the different levels of mastery, right? So the different levels of competency. So what you want them to be at the end of the first year is different than what you want them to be as they graduate. So analyzing a case, we might introduce it in the first year, but we hopefully are doing more of those skills as we're going through the legal education. So what you're looking at, I think, as you map, is to make sure that these core skills that they should be reaching higher levels of competency, that we are actually doing that in classes. So if you just write one time in the first year for 3 hours and you really don't have them do much more writing after that, it's going to be hard for them to ever reach another level of competency.
Mel, did you have any thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I think what was interesting to me in this process is how recursive the process is, and I think you see that a lot with alignment in terms of focusing on the introduction, how we articulate the outcome in the first year, what types of assessment tools we use, how the types of assessment tools might drive the way that we write the learning outcome, and then as we look at and I really believe that because we teach this foundational course, many of our course level outcomes, and more of our course level outcomes will be reflected across the curriculum of legal education than, say, contracts. And so it's particularly important that we have some input on where we get students with regard to those foundational competencies, knowledge, skills, and values at the end of the first year, and that even if we don't teach upper-level writing courses, we can give some feedback to the types of skills that need to be reinforced and the assessment tools that are useful in formative, particularly assessment tools that are going to be useful to reinforce rather than or supplement, or so that we're not being redundant. We really are trying to bring students to the next level. So it's kind of cool how all these things work together.
Well, and on that insightful note, I want to thank our speakers, Susan Duncan, Melissa Warish, and in absentia, Victoria Van Zandt. Thank you so much for all of you for being here. And those of you, as you log out today, you'll see a short survey just asking you a couple questions about today's webinar. And I invite you to join us again in the future. Thank you all from Gulfport, Florida, and have a great day.